Alex Mitchell had always known the streets he called home weren't always kind to people who looked like him. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, he had seen firsthand how police officers treated black men, often with suspicion, disdain, or outright hostility. Alex, a former Marine, had served his country with pride and discipline, but nothing could prepare him for the harsh reality of being targeted simply because of the color of his skin. In his mind, it was a constant cycle. The harassment, the threats, the feeling of always being watched. For years, Alex had kept his head down, trying to live a quiet life. He worked hard, kept to himself, and steered clear of trouble. But everything changed the day his neighbor, Mr. Thompson, an older man who ran a local cleaning business, was pulled over by the police in the middle of the day. The officers had no reason for stopping him. His van was full of cleaning supplies, and the only suspicion was that he was a black man driving in a predominantly white area. The scene was filmed by Thompson's granddaughter, but when the video went viral, it sparked outrage for a moment before dying down. Nothing changed. That moment ignited something in Alex. He couldn't stand by and watch anymore. His neighbors, his community, his people, how many more would suffer? How many more would be harassed, detained, and treated like criminals just because of their skin color? Alex was tired of seeing nothing change. He wanted justice, but he knew that wouldn't come easily. The police system was too well protected, too ingrained in their ways of exploiting the vulnerable. But Alex, a man who had been trained to survive, now wanted to expose the very system that had abused its power for so long. The idea was risky, even dangerous, but Alex knew it was the only way to make a difference. He would set a trap. He would document the truth proof of the injustice that his community had been living with for far too long. He was ready to fight back, but this time it wouldn't be with violence. It would be with the undeniable power of truth. And once the world saw what was really happening, Alex was certain nothing could ever be the same again. Alex Mitchell knew the world didn't always see him for who he truly was. Born and raised in a neighborhood where the streets told stories of hardship, survival, and quiet rebellion, Alex had grown accustomed to walking with his head down, staying out of trouble. Despite being a former Marine who had served his country with honor, he knew that the rules of engagement were different in his community. Here, police officers saw him not as an individual, but as part of a narrative. They had constructed a stereotype of black men as criminals. It was a painful reality, one Alex had tried to ignore for years. But the moment he witnessed the public humiliation of his neighbor, Mr. Thompson, Alex couldn't stay silent any longer. It was a quiet afternoon when the incident occurred. Mr. Thompson, a kind-hearted older man who ran a small cleaning business, was stopped by the police under the guise of a routine check. The officer's eyes had no warmth, only suspicion, as they pulled him over and searched his van, which was filled with cleaning supplies. There was no reason for it, no logic behind the stop. But when Mr. Thompson's granddaughter filmed the whole exchange, it quickly went viral. People were outraged, and Alex, like everyone else, shared the frustration. However, as the days passed, the outrage faded, and with it, the hope for change. It was then that Alex realized how deeply the problem ran. The system, built to protect and serve, had instead become a tool for oppression. He had been seeing it for years, the stop-and-frisk tactics, the targeting of black men in his neighborhood, the constant harassment, and each time the community spoke out, the story was buried. No one cared enough to change the system. No one cared enough to fight for justice. The real victims, the black men like Alex and his neighbors, were left voiceless in a broken system. That's when Alex made the decision. He couldn't just sit back and watch. He had to act. He had always been a quiet observer, but now he saw himself as something more, a protector, a defender, and someone who could bring the truth to light. He couldn't let his community be ignored any longer. The truth was being buried, but Alex would not stand for it. So he reached out to Lisa Tanner, a reporter who had earned a reputation for not backing down when it came to exposing corruption. Lisa wasn't interested in just writing another sensational story. She wanted to show the world what was really happening, not just report on it. Her persistence eventually wore Alex down. He didn't trust reporters, but something about Lisa made him believe she was different. Together, they devised a plan to expose the police officers who had made Mr. Thompson's life miserable. It wasn't going to be easy. In fact, it was dangerous. But the stakes were higher than they had ever been. If they were going to make a difference, they had to show the world exactly how corrupt the system had become. Alex wasn't naive. He knew the risk involved. But as a former Marine, he had been trained for situations like this. He had faced down enemies before. Now, his enemy was a system built to oppress and silence. The plan was simple yet daring. Alex would take a walk through an upscale neighborhood, the kind of place where he knew he would be seen. A place where the police were known to patrol with a heavy hand, targeting anyone who didn't fit in. He would let the officers do what they always did: harass, accuse, and intimidate. But this time, it would be different. This time, the encounter would be captured on hidden cameras, the footage undeniable. It would show the world exactly how these officers operated, and there would be no way to cover it up or make excuses. They would be exposed for who they really were. As Alex walked through the neighborhood, he felt the familiar eyes of suspicion on him. The looks from the neighbors, the stares from the strangers, and the knowing glances from the police had seen it all before. He wasn't just a man walking through the neighborhood. To them, he was a target, a suspect, a threat. As expected, the police took notice. Slowly, they began to follow him, making their move when they thought he had crossed the invisible line they had drawn. It was only a matter of time before they stopped him, questioned him, and tried to make him the criminal they expected him to be. But Alex didn't flinch. He had prepared for this moment. He was calm, controlled, and determined not to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. As the officers approached, their questions sharp and accusatory, Alex knew he had to remain steady. He wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for every black man who had ever been stopped, harassed, or unjustly targeted. This wasn't just a fight for his dignity, it was a fight for the truth. The officers' taunts, their threats, their unprovoked aggression, it was all captured on the hidden cameras. Lisa would use the footage to expose the ugly reality of systemic racism. But more than that, it would show the world what Alex had known all along. This wasn't just about one man, it was about a system that had been broken for too long. And Alex was ready to fight back. He wasn't just a victim anymore, he was a voice for justice, and this time, the world would listen. Alex Mitchell was no stranger to adversity. Living in a neighborhood where the constant presence of police officers made him feel more like a target than a resident, he had learned to keep his head down and mind his business. But everything changed the day he witnessed Mr. Thompson, a beloved member of their community, being harassed and humiliated by the police. It was a situation Alex had seen before, but it never stopped him from feeling helpless. This time, however, something inside him snapped. Watching Mr. Thompson, a man who had always been a model citizen, endure such treatment in front of his family and the community made Alex realize that he couldn't stay silent any longer. It wasn't just about one individual, it was about the systemic racism that had taken root in their society, and he couldn't allow it to continue unchecked. Alex had always known that the police were biased against people of color, but seeing Mr. Thompson's treatment in real time lit a fire within him. The anger that had built up over the years bubbled to the surface. He had seen how officers routinely targeted his friends, his neighbors, and even his own family simply because of the color of their skin. Each time the story was the same: a routine stop, a suspicious person, a fabricated excuse to harass, intimidate, and humiliate. And every time the story ended the same way. Nothing changed. The police never faced consequences, and the cycle of discrimination continued. It was that sense of helplessness and frustration that pushed Alex to take action. He had always felt powerless against the police, knowing that the system was designed to protect them, no matter what they did. But watching Mr. Thompson's humiliation changed everything. Alex couldn't just sit by any longer and allow more innocent people to be treated unfairly. He knew it was dangerous, but it was time to take a stand. That's when Alex met Lisa Tanner. Lisa was a reporter, but not the kind that Alex had learned to distrust over the years. She wasn't interested in chasing headlines or sensational stories. She was committed to uncovering the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be for those in power. Lisa had already gained a reputation for exposing corruption in her reporting, and when Alex met her, he saw that same determination in her eyes. She was different from the others who only came around when there was a story to exploit. She wasn't interested in just writing a report. She wanted to show the world what was really happening in their community. It took some convincing, but eventually Alex agreed to work with Lisa. The plan they came up with was dangerous, but it was the only way they could get undeniable proof of the corruption that had plagued their neighborhood for years. Lisa would help him gather footage of the police in action. Alex would walk through an upscale neighborhood, one that had long been under the scrutiny of the police for no other reason than the color of his skin. He knew the moment he stepped onto those streets, the officers would notice him. They would stop him, question him, and likely harass him. And when they did, Lisa would be there, capturing it all on camera. Alex knew that exposing the police for what they were doing was risky, but it was also necessary. The hidden camera would capture everything, every word, every look, every aggressive movement. The footage would be undeniable. It was the only way to ensure that the story couldn't be swept under the rug. This time, Alex wasn't just going to be another statistic in the system. He wasn't going to let the police get away with their actions. With Lisa's help, he would make sure the world knew the truth. The officers couldn't hide behind their badges this time. They couldn't manipulate the story or twist the facts. The public would see the officers for what they really were: bullies who used their power to intimidate, harass, and violate the rights of innocent people. As Alex began his walk through the neighborhood, the familiar tension started to settle over him. He knew the looks he would receive, the suspicion that would be cast upon him, and the inevitable confrontation that was coming. But this time, he wouldn't back down. He wasn't afraid anymore. The officers' usual tactics of intimidation wouldn't work on him. Alex had prepared for this moment. He was ready to face whatever came next. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his community, his family, and everyone who had suffered under the same system of oppression. He wasn't just walking through a neighborhood, he was walking into history. And he knew that this time justice would prevail. Alex's heart hammered as he gripped the steering wheel, watching two officers approach with hands hovering near their holsters. At 41, this black former firefighter had braved burning buildings but never felt fear like this. Red and blue lights strobed across the quiet suburban street, painting the nearby houses in flashes of color. When the first cop barked, "Step out of the vehicle," Alex carefully unbuckled and climbed out with his empty hands raised in plain sight, a gesture of compliance. He kept his eyes down and his voice calm, doing everything he could to appear non-threatening. Yet the nearest officer's stance stayed hostile, legs apart, one hand on his baton while the second officer moved in close on the other side. Alex mustered the courage to ask, barely above a whisper, "Officer, did I do something wrong?" A rough hand was his only answer. The cop grabbed Alex and slammed his chest onto the hood of the car. "Hands on the hood now," he snarled. Heart pounding, Alex splayed his fingers on the cold metal. His mind reeled. He had done nothing to deserve this. A flash of anger flared at the injustice, but he forced it down and stayed still as a forearm pressed on his neck, pinning him in place. Suddenly, a shove drove Alex hard against the hood. "Don't move!" came a shout. He glimpsed the first officer's baton an instant before it crashed down on the back of his thigh. White-hot pain ripped through his leg, buckling his knees. Alex screamed, his body convulsing even as he kept his palms flat. "I'm not resisting," he cried out desperately. "Shut up! Stop resisting!" one of them barked, the words cruelly ironic as the baton fell again. Another thud, the baton cracked across his back. He couldn't even draw breath as tears blurred his eyes. Alex's world exploded in pain. Before he could recover, they yanked him off the car and hurled him to the pavement. His head smacked the concrete with a dull crack, and the world went dim as a high-pitched ringing flooded his ears. He groaned into the asphalt as a boot dug into his shoulders, keeping him down. Rough hands wrenched his arms behind him and snapped cuffs on his wrists. Even now, a fist smashed into his cheekbone, bursting stars behind his eyes as blood spattered from his nose and the coppery taste filled his mouth. Alex went limp, hoping his complete surrender would make them stop. He had never felt so powerless. The man who once pulled others from flames now prayed that these officers would show him mercy. But still they didn't relent. A knee crushed his back as another baton strike knocked the wind out of him. Terror swelled in Alex's chest at the thought he might die here despite doing everything right. To them, his very existence was provocation enough. But still they didn't relent. A knee crushed his back as another baton strike knocked the wind out of him. Terror swelled in Alex's chest at the thought he might die here despite doing everything right. To them, his very existence was provocation enough. At last, the beating stopped. Panting hard, the officers hauled Alex to his feet. His legs trembled, barely holding him up. He stared at the ground, blood dripping from a split lip, his eyes wet and swollen to slits. In minutes, a routine stop had become a nightmare. He had been calm and obedient, yet they had beaten him mercilessly. Anguish at the injustice mingled with anger that despite his years saving others, to these officers he was nothing but a threat. Any last sense of safety inside him was shattered. Alex stood trembling under the glare of the squad car light shirt, heartbroken and haunted by the fear that to those sworn to protect, he would forever be seen as the enemy. As Alex lay battered in the police car, the air felt thick with uncertainty. Every jolt of the car echoed in his skull, making the pain from his ribs and shoulders flare with each movement. His heart raced, the adrenaline of the brutal confrontation still pumping through his veins. The officers who had attacked him moments ago now remained silent, eyes trained on the road ahead, while he clung to consciousness, struggling to grasp the surreal nature of what had just happened. The police had torn into him just as he had feared they would, all because he was black. And yet, in the pit of his stomach, Alex knew this wouldn't be the end of it. The fight had only begun. Once at the station, the cold steel of the holding cell door slammed shut behind him with an unforgiving clang. The sound reverberated in his bones, a reminder of his place in a world that continued to subject him to violence despite his attempts to prove himself. He had served his country as a firefighter, saved lives and faced danger head-on, but none of that mattered. He wasn't safe now. No amount of credentials, experience, or good deeds would ever shield him from being a target because of the color of his skin. The moments in the holding cell dragged on. Alex had been thrown into the system, stripped of any dignity, left alone with his thoughts, bruised and broken. He could still feel the heat of the officer's baton on his flesh, the crushing weight of the knee in his back, and the humiliation that followed. The cruel words that accompanied every strike haunted him. They had told him to stop resisting, yet all he had done was walk through the streets of his own neighborhood, trying to find some semblance of peace, when the very system that should have protected him turned against him instead. But as the hours passed, something shifted inside him. The initial shock of the attack began to dissolve into a colder, more determined anger. It wasn't just the physical pain that stung, it was the realization that this was bigger than him. This was a recurring nightmare for so many others. His bloodied body, the indifference of the officers, the twisted justification they gave for their actions, it all pointed to a reality that was impossible to ignore. He wasn't just a victim, he was a symbol. And symbols could move mountains. Once at the station, the cold steel of the holding cell door slammed shut behind him with an unforgiving clang. The sound reverberated in his bones, a reminder of his place in a world that continued to subject him to violence, despite his attempts to prove himself. He had served his country as a firefighter, saved lives, and faced danger head-on, but none of that mattered. He wasn't safe now. No amount of credentials, experience, or good deeds would ever shield him from being a target because of the color of his skin. The moments in the holding cell dragged on. Alex had been thrown into the system, stripped of any dignity, left alone with his thoughts, bruised and broken. He could still feel the heat of the officer's baton on his flesh, the crushing weight of the knee in his back, and the humiliation that followed. The cruel words that accompanied every strike haunted him. They had told him to stop resisting, yet all he had done was walk through the streets of his own neighborhood, trying to find some semblance of peace, when the very system that should have protected him turned against him instead. But as the hours passed, something shifted inside him. The initial shock of the attack began to dissolve into a colder, more determined anger. It wasn't just the physical pain that stung, it was the realization that this was bigger than him. This was a recurring nightmare for so many others. His bloodied body, the indifference of the officers, the twisted justification they gave for their actions, it all pointed to a reality that was impossible to ignore. He wasn't just a victim, he was a symbol. And symbols could move mountains. While the officers at the station continued their routine, unfazed by the violence they had just inflicted, Alex's thoughts turned to the only thing he could rely on, the truth. His pain, his fear, everything he had endured wasn't in vain. It had been captured on camera. Lisa Tanner, the determined journalist, had assured him that she would be the one to make sure the world saw what happened. The footage she had would expose everything, the lies, the corruption, the racial profiling that had been ignored for too long. It was undeniable, a sharp contrast to the officer's narrative. He didn't know when the world would see it, but he could already feel the shift. The system that had once made him feel small, helpless, was beginning to crack. People were paying attention. The protests, the public outcry, it was only a matter of time before they couldn't bury the truth any longer. The officers who had brutalized him were no longer untouchable, and neither was the department that had allowed them to get away with it. But Alex knew the battle wasn't over. His release wouldn't be the end of his struggle, it was just the beginning. He would fight for justice, not just for himself, but for every person who had been oppressed and silenced by the system. They wouldn't be able to ignore him any longer. This fight had started as his own, but now it belonged to everyone who had been unjustly targeted. He wasn't going to let them win, not this time. When the cell door finally opened, Alex stood tall, every fiber of his being focused on one singular thought. He was going to make sure that what happened to him wouldn't just fade into another forgotten headline. This wasn't just about one man, it was about the countless others who had been forced to endure the same fate. And Alex Carter would make sure they were heard. Once at the station, the cold steel of the holding cell door slammed shut behind him with an unforgiving clang. The sound reverberated in his bones, a reminder of his place in a world that continued to subject him to violence, despite his attempts to prove himself. He had served his country as a firefighter, saved lives and faced danger head-on, but none of that mattered. He wasn't safe now. No amount of credentials, experience, or good deeds would ever shield him from being a target because of the color of his skin. The moments in the holding cell dragged on. Alex had been thrown into the system, stripped of any dignity, left alone with his thoughts, bruised and broken. He could still feel the heat of the officer's baton on his flesh, the crushing weight of the knee in his back, and the humiliation that followed. The cruel words that accompanied every strike haunted him. They had told him to stop resisting. Yet all he had done was walk through the streets of his own neighborhood, trying to find some semblance of peace, when the very system that should have protected him turned against him instead. But as the hours passed, something shifted inside him. The initial shock of the attack began to dissolve into a colder, more determined anger. It wasn't just the physical pain that stung, it was the realization that this was bigger than him. This was a recurring nightmare for so many others. His bloodied body, the indifference of the officers, the twisted justification they gave for their actions, it all pointed to a reality that was impossible to ignore. He wasn't just a victim, he was a symbol. And symbols could move mountains. While the officers at the station continued their routine, unfazed by the violence they had just inflicted, Alex's thoughts turned to the only thing he could rely on, the truth. His pain, his fear, everything he had endured wasn't in vain. It had been captured on camera. Lisa Tanner, the determined journalist, had assured him that she would be the one to make sure the world saw what happened. The footage she had would expose everything, the lies, the corruption, the racial profiling that had been ignored for too long. It was undeniable, a sharp contrast to the officer's narrative. He didn't know when the world would see it, but he could already feel the shift. The system that had once made him feel small, helpless, was beginning to crack. People were paying attention. The protests, the public outcry, it was only a matter of time before they couldn't bury the truth any longer. The officers who had brutalized him were no longer untouchable, and neither was the department that had allowed them to get away with it. But Alex knew the battle wasn't over. His release wouldn't be the end of his struggle, it was just the beginning. He would fight for justice, not just for himself, but for every person who had been oppressed and silenced by the system. They wouldn't be able to ignore him any longer. This fight had started as his own, but now it belonged to everyone who had been unjustly targeted. He wasn't going to let them win. Not this time. When the cell door finally opened, Alex stood tall, every fiber of his being focused on one singular thought. He was going to make sure that what happened to him wouldn't just fade into another forgotten headline. This wasn't just about one man, it was about the countless others who had been forced to endure the same fate, and Alex Carter would make sure they were heard. The officers at the station had no idea what was coming. They believed that the truth could be buried, that they could manipulate the situation to suit their narrative. But they had underestimated the power of the people, the power of collective outrage, the power of the truth. As the hours ticked by, Alex's mind raced with plans. He knew he had to keep his composure. He knew he had to stay focused. But there was also a deep sense of purpose. He wasn't just a victim. He was part of something much bigger than himself. The system had failed him, but it was about to face consequences for the harm it had caused, not just to him, but to so many others. This fight was bigger than one man. It was about the countless lives that had been destroyed by unjust policing, by systemic racism. Alex was no longer just fighting for his own freedom. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been unjustly targeted, for everyone who had suffered in silence for too long. And as the truth began to unravel, the officers who had once felt untouchable were now realizing that their actions had consequences. The narrative was shifting, and Alex Carter was at the forefront of this change. He sat in the holding cell, bruised but unbroken, his mind racing with the realization that this fight was far from over. The release was just the first step, and as he sat there, the sounds of protests growing outside, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just a symbol of resistance, he was part of a movement that would bring about change. The time for silence had passed. The time for justice was now, The following days were filled with an intense and overwhelming energy as Alex's release from the holding cell marked not just the end of his wrongful detention, but the beginning of a larger movement for justice. The media storm that had surrounded his case only intensified, and the pressure on the police department became impossible to ignore. Across the city, people were marching, protesting, and sharing their own stories of police brutality and racial profiling, each person coming forward to demand justice not only for Alex but for all the others who had been silenced for far too long. The momentum had shifted, and the scales of justice were tipping in favor of those who had been oppressed for generations. Alex stood with his family amidst the throngs of supporters, feeling a sense of relief wash over him as the cheers from the crowd reverberated through the streets. The once stifling atmosphere that had hung over his neighborhood like a dark cloud was now filled with a sense of hope. For the first time, Alex could breathe freely without the constant weight of fear that had been imposed on him by those in power. Yet, even in this moment of triumph, he knew the battle was far from over. The officers who had attacked him and falsely accused him were still out there, still part of a system that had enabled their violence for far too long. The outpouring of public support was unprecedented. Social media exploded with hashtags, viral videos, and countless posts calling for an end to police misconduct. Communities that had been ignored for years were now being heard, their voices amplified by the sheer power of the truth that had been exposed. But even as the public pressure mounted, there were those who fought to protect the corrupt system officers and union members who fought tooth and nail to maintain the status quo. Yet Alex felt a deep sense of determination in his heart. This wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't just about one man or one incident. This was about the countless lives that had been destroyed by the unchecked power of law enforcement. It was about the families who had lost loved ones, the people who had been arrested without cause, the communities that had been torn apart by systemic abuse. The fight was no longer just about him standing up for his own rights. It was about standing up for all of them. As the protests outside the precinct grew louder, Alex couldn't help but feel a sense of pride for his community. People who had once been too afraid to speak out were now marching side by side, demanding accountability. He thought about the elderly man who had once been harassed by the same officers who had targeted him. He thought about the young kids who had grown up learning to fear the very people who were supposed to protect them. They had all suffered in silence for so long, but now they had found their voice. And it wasn't just the protesters. Internal Affairs was now actively investigating the corrupt officers who had abused their power, digging through old records and uncovering evidence of years of misconduct. The department's defenses were crumbling, and the truth could no longer be buried under the weight of false reports and cover-ups. Officer Hale, the man responsible for so much of the violence Alex had endured, was under scrutiny like never before. The case against him and his team was expanding, and soon they would be forced to face the consequences of their actions. Alex knew the road ahead would be challenging. The police union had already begun to fight back, trying to discredit the movement and paint the protests as violent riots. They would stop at nothing to protect their own, but Alex was ready. He had seen the ugliness of the system firsthand, but he had also seen its fragility. When the truth came to light, there was no way to deny it. The evidence was irrefutable. The world was watching, and the system had no choice but to change. As Alex continued to stand tall in the face of adversity, he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't stop now. The fight for justice had only just begun, and this time they were not fighting in silence. This time the voices of the oppressed were being heard loud and clear. Together they would make sure that the world knew the truth, and they would hold those responsible accountable for the pain they had caused. The battle for justice had reached a boiling point, and Alex knew that despite the overwhelming public support and the pressure on law enforcement, the real work had only just begun. His case had sparked a movement, but it was far from over. The weight of the situation had taken a toll on him physically, emotionally, and mentally. Still, he stood strong, determined to push forward, no matter what it took. Every day, more voices joined the call for change, but the resistance from those in power was palpable. The police union had rallied behind its officers, defending them fiercely and attempting to spin the narrative in their favor. They tried to discredit the movement, labeling the protests as nothing more than chaotic riots, hoping to turn public sentiment against the very people who had been fighting for their rights. Despite the narrative they tried to control, the truth had already set its roots in the community. The footage from the incident had been seen across the globe, and people were no longer willing to turn a blind eye. What began as a personal fight for Alex had grown into a collective struggle, for all those who had suffered at the hands of a corrupt and biased system. It was no longer just about one individual, it was about a broken system that needed to be held accountable. The mounting pressure was beginning to break the foundation of the police department. Internal affairs was no longer turning a blind eye, and investigations into the officers involved were accelerating. Every day, more misconduct reports surfaced, revealing the extent to which Officer Hale and his colleagues had manipulated the system for their own benefit. The case had become a symbol, not just for Alex, but for every person who had ever been wrongfully treated by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The investigation revealed a chilling pattern of corruption that reached deep into the department. Officer Hale's team had systematically targeted certain communities, fabricating evidence, making false arrests, and using excessive force to keep their dominance. Alex's fight was no longer just personal, it was a fight to expose the lies and the injustice that had plagued these neighborhoods for years. As the pressure mounted, the officers involved were becoming increasingly agitated. The walls of their defensiveness were beginning to crack under the scrutiny of the public, the media, and the legal system. Meanwhile, the community, once silenced and fearful, was rising up in solidarity. It was a movement that transcended race and background. People who had never considered themselves activists found themselves marching for justice. They stood together, demanding that those who had abused their power face the consequences. The protests grew larger, more organized, and more determined. It was clear that the people were no longer going to allow the system to protect the abusers. It was time for accountability. Alex found strength in these moments of unity. He could feel the support of his community, of the people who had suffered in silence for too long. The fight was about justice, but it was also about healing. The scars left on communities by years of systemic abuse were deep, but Alex knew that the healing could begin with the exposure of the truth. His story had become a catalyst for that change, but it was now a collective effort. It wasn't just about him, it was about every person who had been wronged, every family who had been torn apart by the brutal practices of a broken system. As the days passed, the growing momentum could not be ignored. The voices of the oppressed had finally been heard. The city was changing. The officers who had been so confident in their immunity were now facing the consequences of their actions. Alex's fight had ignited a revolution, and with each step, he knew that there was no turning back. This wasn't just about retribution, it was about setting the stage for a future where justice was the norm, not the exception. Alex had fought for his own freedom, but in doing so, he had helped pave the way for the freedom of so many others, and that was a victory that could never be erased. Alex's story reminds us that the pursuit of justice is timeless and that courage doesn't always wear a uniform. In a world where injustice can still persist behind badges and authority, one young man's decision to stand firm against abuse of power speaks volumes. As older adults, we carry the wisdom of having witnessed many chapters of history, some painful, some triumphant. This story invites us to reflect not only on the importance of personal integrity, but also on our collective responsibility to nurture truth and fairness in our communities. We may not be the ones marching in the streets or holding cameras today, but we can still be pillars of guidance and support. We can share our stories, speak out against wrongs, and teach younger generations the value of standing up for what is right, even when it's hard. Alex's bravery reminds us that justice is not just a political idea, it is a moral duty that begins with compassion and courage. As we age, our influence doesn't fade, it deepens. Let us use our voice, our experience, and our wisdom to help shape a world where truth is defended and dignity is restored for every person in every neighborhood.